For more than 3 decades, the legendary action superstar Jean-Claude Van Damme maintained a strict code of silence regarding his most intense Hollywood rivalries. While whispers grew into deafening roars, internet forums filled with fabricated timelines, and media outlets inflated celebrity egos for clicks, the muscles from Brussels chose total isolation from the drama. This calculated reticence was not born from a lack of conviction or a shortage of explosive material, but rather from a profound understanding that the raw truth was far heavier and more damaging than the passing digital noise surrounding it. Now, at 64 years of age, Van Damme has decisively stopped shielding a fragile Hollywood illusion that was never his personal responsibility to defend or uphold in the first place. What he reveals in his latest candid reflections is neither loud nor dramatically staged for cheap publicity, but it quietly and systematically dismantles one of the most enduring hypermasculine legends in modern action cinema history. Once you truly absorb the gravity of these behind-the-scenes revelations, the iconic multi-decade rivalry between the Belgian kickboxer and Steven Seagal will never look the same to film historians again. It is a cautionary tale of two undisputed industry kings who consciously chose two entirely different roads toward immortality. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, high-octane action cinema completely ruled global pop culture and dictated what young audiences wore, talked about, and emulated. Neighborhood video rental stores were packed wall-to-wall with VHS covers promising devastating fists, earth-shattering explosions, and highly disciplined, muscle-bound heroes conquering insurmountable odds. But among all those brightly colored, testosterone-fueled covers, two distinct names absolutely dominated the rental shelves, the late-night playground debates, and the broader cultural conversation: Jean-Claude Van Damme and Steven Seagal. To the casual global fan base, these two men looked like perfectly matched professional equals on the silver screen. They were two elite martial artists turned legitimate box office movie stars who seemed fundamentally destined by the laws of cinematic physics to eventually collide in a massive crossover blockbuster. In stark reality, however, their personal philosophies, training backgrounds, and psychological approaches to physical conflict could not have been more radically different from one another. Van Damme's entire public identity was built on intense discipline, verifiable exposure, and a documented martial arts pedigree that anyone could easily look up. His background was deeply public, highly measurable, and painstakingly earned the hard way through years of sacrifice, leaving no room for fabricated mystique or unverified claims. The Belgian fighter's early life consisted of grueling years of full-contact training, legitimate European karate tournaments, and genuine physical injuries that left permanent scars on his body. His cinematic fighting style was brilliantly explosive, incredibly athletic, sometimes astonishingly beautiful in its acrobatic precision, and at other times deeply, uncomfortably brutal to witness. When audiences watched him fight on screen, they weren't just watching clever camera angles. They saw fluid human movement, visible sweat, and genuine physical exhaustion. His meteoric rise in Hollywood was not built on an enigmatic mystery or a shadowy past, but on relentless repetition, proving himself again and again in front of cameras and cynical crowds. Steven Seagal arrived in the competitive landscape of Los Angeles with something else entirely wrapped around his imposing persona. His public image was much quieter, noticeably colder, and deliberately wrapped in a dense layer of absolute physical control and philosophical superiority. He did not bounce, skip, or perform theatrical spinning heel kicks to entertain the audience. Instead, he stood perfectly still like a stoic monolith, effortlessly dismantling terrified screen opponents with minimal visible effort and slick, joint-locking techniques. His brooding presence suggested hidden mystical depth, secret governmental knowledge, and a dangerous man who knew lethal things others simply did not. Hollywood executives absolutely loved that constructed aura because it allowed the paying audience to easily believe there was something far more dangerous beneath the surface, something unspoken and perhaps highly classified. For a golden window of time, this elaborate cinematic illusion worked flawlessly, and both men thrived beyond their wildest financial dreams. Both individuals became global marketing icons, living legends whose names alone could greenlight a multi-million-dollar studio production in a matter of hours. But beneath the staggering wealth and international success, a deep professional fracture was already forming along the fault lines of their respective careers. This growing animosity was not merely over top billing, box office receipts, or Hollywood fame, but over something far more intensely personal to a true martial artist: fundamental legitimacy. In the early 1990s, subtle, passive-aggressive comments began circulating through industry trade magazines and martial arts publications. These were not direct, front-page attacks or loud, dramatic headlines, but rather carefully placed doubts and coded criticisms intended to undermine credibility. There were constant lingering questions about what truly counted as real effective fighting in the streets, with philosophical jabs disguised as high-minded martial arts commentary. Although no specific name was spoken aloud during these interviews, everyone in the tight-knit stunt community knew exactly who was being targeted. Van Damme heard the whispers clearly. The broader entertainment industry took notice of the tension, and slowly, a quiet, cold line was drawn between two men who were never meant to inhabit the same physical space. This was not a loud, theatrical public feud played out for the tabloids. There were no screaming matches at high-profile awards ceremonies or televised talk show confrontations. It was far colder, more calculated, and deeply professional than that, creating an underlying anxiety across major film studios. Sharp producers noticed the friction, veteran stunt coordinators quietly complained about scheduling conflicts, and exclusive Hollywood party invitations were carefully adjusted behind closed doors. Production schedules were deliberately separated by nervous executives, and the unspoken golden rule among top agents became incredibly simple: keep them apart at all costs. For years, that fragile silence held firm across the industry, until one fateful night inside the private residence of another monumental action legend, when the silence finally ran out. By the time the late 1990s arrived, the traditional action cinema landscape was undergoing a massive, irreversible paradigm shift. The glorious golden era that had built multi-decade careers on raw physicality, practical stunts, and real muscle was slowly giving way to digital special effects and newer faces. Yet the legendary old guard still mattered immensely to the culture, and their iconic names still carried tremendous box office weight and creative influence worldwide. That is precisely what made one particular rainy night so incredibly charged with raw masculine tension during a highly private gathering hosted at the luxurious home of Sylvester Stallone. This exclusive event was not a crowded movie premiere, a media junket, or a promotional press event designed for public consumption. There were no flashing paparazzi cameras waiting outside the gates, and no entertainment journalists had been granted access to the property. It was simply a secure private room filled to the brim with the legendary alpha males who had single-handedly defined an entire cinematic genre for a generation. Icons like Arnold Schwarzenegger, Bruce Willis, and Jean-Claude Van Damme were mingling comfortably when Steven Seagal unexpectedly arrived, shifting the room's energy instantly. For most of the elite guests resting in attendance that evening, the gathering was a beautiful exercise in mutual respect and Hollywood nostalgia. For the Belgian kickboxer, however, the atmosphere quickly transformed into something entirely different and deeply confrontational. By that specific point in his career, he had heard quite enough of the underhanded insults and dismissive remarks. He had endured years of indirect, highly insulting comments regarding his athletic abilities, growing tired of being constantly reduced by his rival to a superficial cinematic stereotype. To Seagal, Van Damme was merely a classical dancer, a flashy stage performer, and an agile athlete pretending to be a hardened, dangerous combatant. The European star had never responded publicly to these provocations, choosing instead to take the high road and never swallow the bait thrown by the media. But on that legendary night inside Stallone's private estate, the comfortable professional distance between the two rivals completely disappeared in an instant. The derogatory remarks were no longer being filtered through heavily edited magazine interviews or passing industry gossip. They were being uttered close enough to hear across the room, delivered with a smug, undeniable sense of physical superiority. Van Damme did not explode in a fit of blind rage, nor did he engage in theatrical Hollywood posturing to draw attention to himself. Instead, he calmly stood up from his seat and did something far more unsettling to the wealthy alpha males occupying that quiet room. He walked directly over to Seagal, made the situation incredibly simple, and looked him dead in the eye. He confidently confronted his longtime detractor face-to-face and explicitly asked him to step outside into Stallone's expansive backyard to settle the dispute. He proposed a clean environment with no audience, no fabricated stories, and no public reputations to protect, just two middle-aged men discovering the absolute truth of their physical abilities. The dynamic of the entire room shifted instantly, as conversation ground to a halt and wealthy executives held their breath in collective disbelief. This was no longer a choreographed Hollywood movie set with stunt doubles, protective padding, and directors screaming for a second take. Everyone present in that elite circle understood exactly what that blunt physical invitation meant, and every eye waited anxiously for the inevitable response. It never came from the imposing martial artist. Seagal did not stand up to defend his honor, nor did he accept the clear-cut challenge issued by the younger, more athletic star. Instead, he masterfully deflected the entire confrontation, laughing it off nervously and treating the intense request like a bizarre, trivial joke that was entirely beneath his spiritual stature. To some casual observers in the room, his passive reaction looked like admirable Buddhist restraint and martial arts discipline. To many others who understood the psychological dynamics of real fighters, however, it looked like a clear, undeniable display of pure physical avoidance. But regardless of the individual interpretations in the room, the underlying message of that brief, tense encounter was completely unmistakable to everyone present. The very man who had spent years publicly questioning another fighter's legitimacy was utterly unwilling to answer the call when that challenge stood directly in front of him. Later that same night, at a high-end Los Angeles nightclub where the party had migrated, Van Damme approached him for a second time. It was the exact same offer, delivered with the exact same calm certainty, and met with the exact same stubborn refusal from the Aikido master. Years later, Sylvester Stallone himself would publicly confirm to the media what many individuals in that room had already quietly believed for decades. He stated definitively that the physical challenge was entirely real and that the legendary rivalry had essentially ended right then and there on his property. It did not conclude with broken bones or flying fists, but with a crushing silence choosing a definitive side in the argument. Once that psychological line was crossed in private, there was absolutely no going back to the way things were before between the two action icons. After that dramatic, unspoken showdown at Stallone's house, the legendary Hollywood story really should have reached its natural conclusion. Two famous men had crossed paths, one had issued a direct physical challenge, the other had quietly declined, and the rest of Hollywood simply moved on. But behind tightly closed executive doors, something much larger, riskier, and financially unprecedented began to take shape within the entertainment industry. In the early 2000s, legendary movie producer Peter Guber stepped into the arena with a revolutionary concept that absolutely stunned everyone who heard it. This was explicitly not a movie project, a scripted television show, or a pay-per-view professional wrestling spectacle. There would be no written script to memorize, no complex fight choreography to rehearse, and absolutely no second takes if someone made a mistake. He formally proposed a real, fully sanctioned, publicly broadcasted shoot fight that would be completely impossible for either man to explain away or make excuses for. The high-profile location for this ultimate martial arts showdown was already tentatively set at the iconic Mirage Hotel and Casino in Las Vegas. The financial compensation being thrown around by wealthy backers was absolutely enormous, offering a staggering $20 million flat for Jean-Claude Van Damme. The exact same massive financial amount was officially put on the table for Steven Seagal, making it one of the highest-paying combat sports events in history. For the Belgian star, the monumental career decision did not take long at all, as he viewed it as an opportunity for ultimate validation. He did not ask for special rules, he did not demand custom round lengths, and he did not insist on specific safety conditions. He agreed to the contract immediately because he did not want a hollow media spectacle. He deeply wanted absolute cinematic finality. A professional fighting ring does not care about clever media interviews, slick publicity agents, or carefully curated studio mythology. Inside those four corners, everything becomes completely measurable, transparent, and undeniably true under the bright lights of reality. The official response from the Seagal camp, however, never arrived at the producer's office, leaving the massive project completely dead in the water. There was no formal counteroffer submitted, no official rejection letter drafted, and no logical explanation provided to the eager financial backers. There was only a massive, lingering silence, and that specific silence changed the historical narrative of their rivalry forever. This was no longer a private party confrontation between two tipsy celebrities, nor was it unverified Hollywood hearsay passed down through stuntmen. This was a completely equal financial offer, fully backed by serious institutional money in a desert city built entirely on the concept of public proof. One man enthusiastically said yes to the risk, while the other man effectively disappeared from the conversation entirely. For many years, almost no one in the general public knew this massive real-world fight had even been formally proposed by a major producer. There was no modern social media landscape, no instant digital outrage cycles, and no viral video clips dissecting the hidden mechanics of the aborted deal. The legendary story lived quietly and exclusively among elite producers, powerful talent agents, and real-world fighters who understood exactly what that silence meant. The general public would only hear about the $20 million offer decades later, when Van Damme finally decided that the absolute truth no longer required his protective silence. When he finally spoke about the failed Las Vegas event in modern interviews, he did not gloat, puff out his chest, or mock his rival's cowardice. He simply stated the chronological sequence of events calmly, precisely, and with a chilling lack of emotional bias. The official offer existed, the financial terms were completely equal, he signed his end of the contract, but Seagal did not. That single historical fact did far more damage to his rival's legacy than any petty internet insult or public call-out ever could have achieved. It cleanly separated theatrical performance from real physical risk, and creative storytelling from actual physical consequence. Once that undeniable line was drawn by a neutral third-party businessman, the carefully crafted martial arts myth could never fully recover its original luster. Decades after that immense silence had settled over the industry, the legendary story suddenly resurfaced in the most unexpected and shocking way imaginable. It did not happen through a confrontational tell-all interview or a random public sighting, but through a single highly cryptic photograph posted to social media. One striking digital image uploaded online showed Jean-Claude Van Damme and Steven Seagal sitting together at the exact same dinner table. There was absolutely no context provided, no lengthy explanation offered, just a brief, mysterious caption hinting that something incredibly important was finally coming for the fans. For millions of aging action movie enthusiasts who had spent their entire lives debating this fierce rivalry, the online reaction was immediate. There was widespread shock, intense confusion, and a sudden wave of nostalgic hope rippling through the global martial arts community. After more than 30 long years of deep professional tension, mutual avoidance, and massive unfinished business, here they finally were. They were sitting side by side, smiling for the camera, at least on a superficial, performative level for the digital world to see. The internet immediately did what the internet always does when presented with a massive vacuum of information. It filled the digital silence with wild, imaginative theories ranging from a grand public reconciliation to a massive collaborative movie deal. Some fans wildly speculated about a comprehensive retrospective documentary, while others naively believed a real-world exhibition fight was finally happening in their twilight years. But what that glossy photograph highly suggested to the public, and what it actually meant in reality, were two completely different things. Van Damme would later clarify to the press that the private dinner was absolutely not a joyful reunion, and it certainly did not represent mutual forgiveness. It was born purely out of his own deep personal curiosity, functioning as a final, real-world psychological check on his old nemesis. After so many decades of hearing wild stories, enduring strange refusals, and dealing with unanswered questions, he wanted to see for himself whether time had changed anything. He did not care about the status of Seagal's career or his current public image. He wanted to evaluate the actual essence of the man. Sadly, it hadn't changed a bit. There was absolutely no genuine human warmth present at the table, no shared Hollywood history fondly revisited, and no mature acknowledgement of what had been said or avoided in the distant past. There was only rigid, cold politeness, a massive sense of emotional distance, and a familiar, brooding presence wrapped tightly in the same old theatrical performance. Whatever the Belgian star had truly hoped to find across the table that night, whether it was genuine humility, raw honesty, or a sense of mutual closure, simply wasn't there. The misleading social media caption that had confidently promised a major global announcement never led to anything real or substantial for the film industry. No collaborative cinematic project followed the meeting, no official explanation ever arrived from their representation, and the heavy silence returned once again. This time the silence felt far heavier and more permanent because it definitively confirmed what many industry insiders had already quietly suspected for years. That brief, calculated dinner was not the beautiful beginning of a lasting peace between two aging warriors. It was merely the stark, final confirmation that peace was entirely unnecessary because the rivalry had already been decided by history. For Van Damme, the fleeting moment mattered deeply not because it repaired a damaged relationship, but because it permanently ended all lingering personal doubt. Some epic Hollywood stories simply do not require a loud, dramatic, cinematic ending to satisfy the soul. They merely require absolute, unvarnished clarity, and true clarity does not always arrive with a massive amount of theatrical noise. The viral photograph quickly faded from internet headlines, the unanswered questions remained buried, and soon after, Van Damme stopped hinting at the feud altogether. He finally started speaking plainly, directly, and without a single shred of remorse about his rival's true nature. When the elaborate martial arts myth finally collapsed under its own weight, the world watched in utter fascination as the curtains were pulled back. For the vast majority of his illustrious cinematic career, Jean-Claude Van Damme had avoided using one highly radioactive word at all costs. He kept that word buried not because it wasn't completely accurate, but because once it was spoken aloud to the media, it would end the story forever. Silence allowed a comfortable level of ambiguity to exist, and silence allowed grand Hollywood legends to breathe and evolve over time. But as the decades marched on, that protective silence began protecting the wrong thing entirely, shielding falsehoods at the expense of reality. When Van Damme finally chose to speak openly in his later European interviews, his calm tone completely surprised many media professionals. There was no explosive anger visible in his eyes, no petty sense of vindictive satisfaction, just an overwhelming sense of profound fatigue. It was the specific kind of deep weariness that comes from watching a beautiful piece of fiction consistently outlive the hard truth. He patiently explained to interviewers that the core problem between them was never about simple box office competition, nor was it about fragile Hollywood egos. It was never truly about who sold more movie tickets worldwide or who looked significantly tougher on screen to the average teenager. The deep, irreparable fracture between them came from something far deeper, a fundamental respect for what the martial arts actually are as a lifestyle. Van Damme had spent his formative youth bleeding in real, unyielding combat rings under intense, terrifying physical pressure. He understood that world deeply, a harsh environment where fragile reputations instantly collapse the very moment you cannot back up your claims with physical action. He never romanticized that brutal world of full-contact fighting, because he had actually survived it and carried the physical toll of it. What deeply troubled his soul for decades was the elaborate manufactured mythology systematically built around his rival's entire public existence. There were endless unverified stories of secret military operations, heavily implied real-world combat experience, and dark narratives that intentionally blurred cinema and reality. This went on until mainstream audiences could no longer tell the difference between a movie character and a real human being. According to Van Damme's direct assessment, absolutely none of that grandiose mythology was anchored in any form of verifiable independent athletic competition. There were no official tournament records to review, no sanctioned full-contact fights on tape, and no official athletic record where performance meets actual consequence. That is precisely when the Belgian icon finally said the word, delivering it calmly, evenly, and without any dramatic vocal emphasis. He called his rival's carefully curated public image an absolute total fraud. The heavy word landed significantly harder than any standard Hollywood insult ever could have, because it was not designed to wound a man's feelings. It was designed to permanently clarify a historical record. In an entertainment genre entirely obsessed with hypermasculine toughness, Van Damme was not engaging in a petty personal attack against the man himself. He was systematically and cleanly dismantling a grand cultural myth that had fooled millions of people for over 30 years. Once that myth was completely dismantled by someone who lived the reality, it perfectly explained everything that had transpired over their careers. It illuminated all the strange refusals, the sudden disappearances, the heavy silence, and the $20 million Las Vegas fight that vanished into thin air. Interestingly, even after delivering that devastating blow to his rival's legacy, Van Damme stopped short of displaying genuine personal hatred. He maturely acknowledged his rival's undeniable early screen presence, his unique charisma, and the brilliant way audiences once leaned forward in excitement. What he rejected completely was not the talented actor himself, but the deceptive narrative that crossed a dangerous line from cinema into false real-world authority. By the time the Belgian star finished speaking his mind to the world, there was absolutely nothing left for internet sleuths to speculate about. The legendary rivalry was no longer an unresolved, lingering question mark in the annals of Hollywood history. It had simply been a one-sided affair for far too long. With that absolute truth finally spoken clearly into existence, Van Damme calmly turned his creative attention elsewhere, toward an ending of his own choosing. It was a quiet, dignified ending built on self-reflection, not a loud, hollow victory lap over a fallen contemporary. Part 2. After everything had finally been said and exposed to the light of day, Jean-Claude Van Damme refused to linger on the bitter dynamics of the feud. There was no massive international press tour built around the shocking revelations, no celebratory media appearances, and no cruel attempt to further humiliate a rival. He understood that his aging contemporary had already faded significantly from the vibrant center of the modern action genre they had once ruled together. Instead of looking backward, he consciously shifted his creative focus toward something far more personal, the profound idea of ending his own cinematic story on completely honest terms. At 64, Van Damme spoke openly and passionately about working on what he explicitly described as his final martial arts film, titled Battleground. This upcoming project was conceptually not a desperate return to past commercial glory, nor was it a hollow nostalgia piece designed to mindlessly relive old box office victories. It was something noticeably darker, significantly heavier, and far more deeply reflective of a man staring down his own mortality. He described the cinematic narrative as a violent, philosophical collision between the raw, unyielding intensity that once completely defined his youthful career and the modern world. This creative choice mattered immensely to his legacy because it clearly demonstrated that Van Damme was entirely uninterested in rewriting historical realities for his own ego. He was not trying to win a superficial rivalry in his senior years, because by the time he finally spoke the truth, the physical fight no longer mattered. The unanswered challenge at Stallone's mansion, the massive amount of money left on the table in Las Vegas, and the decades of avoidance had already written their own natural conclusion. Publicly, the Belgian icon even took steps to soften his overall vocal tone, demonstrating a level of emotional maturity rarely seen in Hollywood. He stated directly that he harbored absolutely no personal problems or lingering hatred toward his old rival anymore, viewing the past through a lens of philosophical growth. He noted that youth naturally makes young men chase dominant alpha status, but age inevitably makes those intense, testosterone-driven battles feel incredibly small and insignificant. But beneath that perfectly calm, respectful surface, he never once reversed the hard facts of what had occurred, nor did he ever correct the historical record. Peace of mind for Van Damme did not require a dishonest revision of historical truths to make his contemporary feel comfortable. That is precisely what gives this sweeping Hollywood saga its incredible moral weight and lasting impact on the global martial arts community. There was no final explosive confrontation in a crowded arena, no cinematic showdown on a rain-slicked rooftop, and no dramatic moment where they settled the score. Instead, there was something infinitely quieter, more profound, and ultimately far more devastating to a manufactured reputation. There was simply one aging man who was entirely willing to risk reality under the eyes of the world, and another man who never was. In the absolute end of this decades-long narrative, Van Damme did not aggressively destroy a legendary Hollywood icon, he simply stopped carrying the weight of it. When he finally let the illusion go, the truth did not sound angry, vengeful, or malicious. It sounded deeply tired, completely final, and profoundly human. That quiet realization may be the most beautifully tragic part of this entire cinematic saga. Now that the decades of heavy silence are gone forever, the fundamental question remaining for film historians is incredibly simple to frame. Was this legendary rivalry ever truly real to begin with, or was it merely sustained because one man consistently refused to step forward? In the grand scheme of human life, does telling the absolute truth ultimately matter significantly more than winning a physical fight in a ring? To understand the depth of this cultural collision, one must examine how the media landscape of the era allowed unverified claims to weaponize themselves. In the pre-internet age of cinema, movie studios possessed an unprecedented level of absolute control over the personal narratives of their highly paid stars. Public relations departments could easily manufacture entire backstories for an actor, scrubbing away inconvenient truths and replacing them with highly marketable, dangerous pasts. If a studio executive decided that a new action star needed to look like a deadly, covert counterterrorism expert, the media machinery complied. Magazines would run profile pieces detailing shadowy training regimens in remote, unnamed foreign lands, completely free from the modern burden of digital fact-checking. Audiences of the late 80s were incredibly trusting, consuming these highly cinematic profiles as absolute gospel truth while purchasing theater tickets by the millions. This lack of informational transparency created an environment where a charismatic performer could easily masquerade as an elite real-world combatant without ever producing a single shred of official documentation. Van Damme, despite his flamboyant screen persona and reliance on dazzling splits, operated under a completely different transparent paradigm from the very beginning of his journey. His physical capabilities were not a matter of studio speculation or clever editing techniques, they were a matter of public record in Europe. Long before he ever set foot in a Hollywood studio or signed a multi-picture contract, he had stood on mats in front of hostile crowds. He had competed in legitimate sanctioned karate championships, where judges scored points based on timing, precision, and physical impact. The sweat he poured on those competitive mats was real, the anxiety of facing an aggressive opponent was documented, and the risk of public failure was constant. When he transitioned into the world of mainstream cinema, he brought that foundational understanding of athletic risk along with him. He viewed the movie screen not as a place to hide his limitations behind a wall of mystical secrets, but as a grand stage to display the extreme results of his physical discipline. This fundamental difference in their foundational roots created a slow-burning ideological conflict that was completely bound to explode eventually. As the box office returns for both stars reached astronomical heights in the early 90s, their internal studio camps became intensely protective of their respective domains. Van Damme was consistently generating massive profits for studios like Universal and Columbia, proving that his athletic, high-kicking style possessed incredible global appeal. Meanwhile, Seagal was carving out a highly lucrative, fiercely loyal niche with his gritty, hyper-violent urban crime thrillers for Warner Bros. The entertainment industry, driven by its insatiable appetite for profitable conflict, naturally began playing these two towering egos against each other. Behind the scenes, agents and managers would subtly drop hints to directors about why their specific client was the superior martial artist. Stunt crews who worked on both sets would exchange stories about the radically different environments maintained by the two action stars. On a Van Damme set, the atmosphere was often described as intensely athletic, highly demanding, and focused heavily on physical repetition to achieve cinematic perfection. On a Seagal set, the vibe was reportedly far more intense, with an emphasis on absolute hierarchical control and a constant projection of real-world lethal authority. This professional polarization meant that a collision was completely inevitable, as the industry wasn't big enough for two totally conflicting definitions of martial arts mastery. The subtle psychological warfare began expanding into the realm of choreography choices and the specific ways they chose to dispatch their on-screen opponents. Van Damme's films increasingly showcased his vulnerability as a human being, often featuring extended sequences where his character took a savage beating before rallying. This narrative choice allowed the audience to connect deeply with his physical struggle, showcasing the raw endurance required to overcome adversity. Conversely, his rivals' films featured characters who were virtually untouchable, moving through armies of opponents without ever sustaining a single scratch or losing their composure. This stylistic choice was designed to reinforce the carefully constructed illusion of an elite, effortless master who operated on a completely different physical plane. To the trained eyes of real-world martial artists working as stunt coordinators in Hollywood, this contrast was incredibly telling. They recognized that one style was rooted in the grueling, painful reality of combat sports, while the other was a carefully staged dance designed to protect an unyielding ego. The growing tension between these two completely opposed cinematic philosophies finally began to manifest as quiet, localized disruptions across the industry landscape. Highly respected martial arts masters who visited Los Angeles were frequently forced to navigate the invisible political minefields laid down by both camps, if a legendary trainer associated themselves too closely with the Belgian star. They risked being permanently blacklisted from working on lucrative projects across town. Conversely, individuals who questioned the historical validity of the Aikido master's highly publicized lineage found themselves facing intense professional isolation. This toxic atmosphere of enforced loyalty and unverified dominance created a deep, underlying resentment among the hardworking stunt professionals of Hollywood. They were the ones who actually had to take the physical falls, absorb the stiff strikes, and maintain the public illusion of absolute supremacy for the stars. Many of these veteran stuntmen possessed far more legitimate combat experience than the actors they were paid to look bad against on camera. They watched the growing rivalry with a mixture of professional amusement and deep, underlying cynicism, waiting for the day the illusion would face reality. As the decade progressed, the whispers regarding the ultimate backyard showdown became a legendary staple of Hollywood film industry lore. Every low-budget production office, late-night editing bay, and stunt training facility had its own variation of the Stallone Mansion story. Some internet rumors claimed that a physical altercation had actually taken place in the shadows of the estate, resulting in a swift, embarrassing defeat for one of the parties. Others insisted that high-powered industry lawyers had intervened at the last possible microsecond, threatening massive breach of contract lawsuits if either star sustained a visible facial injury. These wildly escalating rumors only served to increase the intense pressure mounting on both men to provide some form of definitive public proof. The martial arts community, which thrived on the concept of clear lineage and open challenge, was growing increasingly impatient with the endless posturing. They demanded to know whether the untouchable screen master could actually perform against a highly conditioned, world-class athlete who wasn't paid to fall down. The silence from one side of the camp during this era of intense speculation was deeply telling to those who knew how to read the industry. When the monumental $20 million Las Vegas offer was quietly engineered by Peter Guber, it represented the absolute apex of this historical pressure. Guber was not a low-level promoter looking to make a quick buck. He was a highly sophisticated, deeply respected industry titan with massive institutional backing. He recognized that a real-world, unscripted match between these two cultural icons would easily generate a level of global pay-per-view interest rivaling the biggest boxing matches. The contract terms were meticulously drafted by top-tier sports attorneys to ensure absolute fairness, complete neutrality, and a level playing field for both participants. There were no hidden clauses designed to favor one specific fighting style over the other, and the financial payout was completely guaranteed by major casinos. For Van Damme, signing that piece of paper was an act of supreme professional liberation, an opportunity to permanently wash away decades of unverified insults. He was fully prepared to step into the harsh, unforgiving light of a Las Vegas ring, knowing that his entire legacy was on the line. The absolute refusal of the other camp to even acknowledge the existence of this life-changing contract was the turning point that permanently cracked the myth. To the powerful executives who controlled the financing of major Hollywood action films, that silence spoke far louder than any box office report ever could. They realized that when presented with a massive guaranteed fortune to prove his real-world capabilities, the untouchable master chose complete and total evasion. The financial community's perception of the two stars began to shift subtly, but permanently following the collapse of the Las Vegas deal. Insurance companies that bonded high-budget action films began asking more pointed questions about stunt safety and the physical conditioning of their aging leads. The era of allowing a single actor to dictate terms based on an unverified aura of lethal mystique was rapidly drawing to a close. Van Damme, despite his well-documented personal struggles with fame during the mid-90s, maintained a reputation as a relentless physical worker who respected the craft. Directors knew that if they hired the Belgian star, they were getting a dedicated athlete who would perform his own complex choreography until his body was completely exhausted. The respect he earned from his peers during this difficult transitional period was built on his transparent vulnerability and undeniable work ethic. As the new millennium dawned, the traditional action genre found itself increasingly marginalized by the rise of massive comic book franchises and CGI-driven blockbusters. The aging titans of the 90s were suddenly forced to navigate a completely different industry landscape, one that valued digital assets over raw muscle. This industry shift made the lingering, unresolved questions surrounding the historic rivalry feel increasingly archaic to the younger generation of studio executives. Yet for the hardcore global fan base that had built their youth around these iconic figures, the debate never truly died out. It lived on in the early days of internet video platforms, where fans would meticulously analyze old film clips frame by frame to compare speed and precision. The lack of definitive closure from that legendary night at Stallone's house continued to fuel an endless cycle of digital speculation and fan fiction. It became a permanent piece of modern pop culture mythology, a lingering mystery about what would have happened if the silence had never chosen a side. Part 3. The highly publicized digital photograph of the awkward dinner meeting was a masterclass in modern public relations manipulation and fan expectations. When the image first flashed across global social media feeds, it functioned as a powerful ink blot test for a generation of nostalgic movie fans. Those who desperately wanted a heartwarming, cinematic conclusion to the bitter rivalry chose to see a beautiful moment of late-life forgiveness and mutual respect. They imagined the two old lions finally putting aside their massive egos over an expensive meal, sharing war stories about the golden era of action cinema. But to the seasoned industry veterans who had spent decades navigating the dark underbelly of Hollywood politics, the image looked entirely different. They saw a carefully calculated, deeply uncomfortable corporate photo opportunity that was completely devoid of genuine human connection. Van Damme's subsequent, brutally honest clarification of that evening completely shattered the manufactured internet narrative once and for all. He revealed that beneath the polite smiles forced for the smartphone camera, the atmosphere was completely saturated with the same old cold evasion. The Belgian star's willingness to publicly describe the dinner as a total failure of connection was an incredibly rare moment of raw honesty in a town built entirely on fake relationships. He chose to entirely dismantle the comfortable lie of a happy reconciliation because he simply could no longer tolerate the ongoing performance. He realized that his aging contemporary was still completely trapped inside the prison of his own manufactured myth, unable to step out of character for even a single evening of authentic human interaction. There was no humble acknowledgement of past mistakes, no sincere apology for the decades of underhanded insults, and no desire to find real common ground. The realization was deeply liberating for Van Damme, as it made him realize that the rivalry had never truly been about him at all. It was an internal struggle within a man who had built his entire existence on a foundation of unverified authority and cinematic illusions. By walking away from that dinner table with total clarity, the Belgian fighter finally freed his own soul from the lingering ghosts of the past. This profound psychological breakthrough is precisely what set the stage for his current philosophical approach to his final creative project, Battleground. At 64 years of age, he is no longer running away from the natural aging process, nor is he attempting to hide his physical limitations behind clever camera tricks. He is consciously choosing to showcase a character who is physically broken, deeply flawed, and carrying the heavy weight of a violent life. This narrative direction stands in stark, beautiful contrast to his old rival, who continues to release low-budget films where his characters remain completely untouchable masters. Van Damme's willingness to embrace his own human vulnerability on screen is the ultimate proof of his genuine artistic and martial arts legitimacy. He does not require a fabricated aura of secret military expertise to command respect from a modern audience. His lifetime of documented physical work speaks entirely for itself. The world of cinema has shifted permanently, and history has finally delivered its definitive verdict on the two kings of the video rental shelf. When analyzing the collapse of his rival's public myth, it is crucially important to understand that Van Damme's critique was never rooted in professional jealousy. The Belgian icon had achieved a level of mainstream pop culture immortality that few action stars could ever dream of replicating. His unique physical feats, such as his legendary terminal splits atop moving vehicles, had become permanent fixtures of global advertising and internet culture. He had absolutely nothing left to prove to the accounting departments of Hollywood studios or the global box office tracking metrics. His modern spoken testimony was delivered purely as a profound act of cultural preservation for the true spirit of the martial arts. To a man who had dedicated his entire childhood to the grueling reality of full-contact dojos, the romanticization of unverified combat experience was a deeply offensive distortion of reality. He recognized that allowing a completely manufactured illusion of lethal authority to stand unchallenged was an insult to every real fighter who had ever stepped into a ring. By calmly labeling the image a fraud, he performed a necessary, long overdue act of historical clarification for future generations of martial artists. The broader international impact of Van Damme's modern interviews has triggered a massive, overdue reevaluation of the entire late 80s action cinema boom. Modern film historians and cultural critics are finally looking past the flashy choreography and explosive practical stunts to examine the authentic human costs of stardom. They are beginning to recognize the immense psychological pressure that was placed on these men to constantly embody their larger-than-life screen personas in their private lives. Some individuals completely lost themselves inside the intoxicating labyrinth of their own studio-created mythology, permanently alienating their peers and becoming caricatures of toughness. Others, like the reflective Belgian kickboxer, endured a painful, decades-long journey through the dark valleys of fame before finally emerging with their humanity fully intact. This profound personal evolution is what ultimately separates the enduring legacy of a true artist from the fading memory of a performative illusion. The global audience, armed with the transparency of the modern digital age, can easily sense the profound difference between authenticity and a lifelong performance. As production continues on his final cinematic effort, the atmosphere surrounding Van Damme is notably light, peaceful, and entirely free from the toxic energy of past rivalries. Stuntmen and young actors who are fortunate enough to work alongside him on the set of Battleground describe a man who is incredibly generous with his vast wisdom. He no longer carries himself with the defensive, hypermasculine posture that defined his youth, choosing instead to lead his crew with humility and humor. He frequently takes time between complex setups to openly discuss his past mistakes, offering his life story as a valuable cautionary tale for the next generation of creative performers. The lingering shadow of his old rival no longer holds any power over his daily thoughts or his future artistic choices. The historic $20 million contract left unsigned in Las Vegas and the tense backyard challenge at Stallone's estate have transitioned into peaceful milestones on his road to ultimate self-acceptance. He has completely mastered the final, most difficult technique of any true martial arts journey, the beautiful art of letting go. Ultimately, the magnificent story of Jean-Claude Van Damme and Steven Seagal transcends the narrow boundaries of old action cinema and Hollywood gossip columns. It stands as a timeless, universal parable about the fundamental nature of human ego, the heavy burden of illusions, and the ultimate victory of unvarnished reality. It reminds us that a life built entirely on a foundation of manufactured mysteries and unverified dominance is an incredibly fragile structure, destined to eventually collapse under the weight of truth. True strength does not manifest as a rigid projection of absolute invulnerability or a stubborn refusal to ever face a real-world challenge. Real strength is found in the willingness to step into the harsh light of reality, to risk public failure, and to openly embrace one's own human limitations with complete dignity. Van Damme didn't have to win a physical fight at Stallone's house or collect a massive check in Las Vegas to prove his absolute superiority to the world. He won the legendary rivalry the exact moment he chose to stop protecting a myth that was never his to defend, allowing the quiet truth to finally speak for itself.